all of you fine ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today to address your group. My name is Thomas Henry Barnes, and I come to you today from Olean, New York, which is near Jamestown, New York, if you're not familiar with the southern tier of New York State. I want to tell you how much I appreciate that you invited me, a barber, to talk to you about my family's history, and particularly honored to be in this association, this annual meeting of your historical association here in 1942. I understand you have this session regularly. You know, I was born in 1849, so I am 93 years old this year, and it is a great thrill for me to have people listening to me besides my family who have to listen. Well, I thought I would start with my father's story. My father was Henry Barnes, and he was born about the year 1818 outside of Richmond, Virginia. My father knew very little of his parents, but because he was born enslaved outside of Richmond. But when he was taken away from the farm at a very early age, a woman he remembers as his mother gave him a small child-sized quilt to take away with him. Now, my father said she did that so that he would remember where he came from. He was taken from the farm by a man who came from Hagerstown in Maryland to buy up young black boys and young colored men. And those enslaved boys and men were the source of this man's wealth. He called himself Reverend Barnes. And he would have them trained. He taught them each to read and write against the laws of the state of both Virginia and Maryland at the time, as one of our speakers has already mentioned. I should mention that I was just filled with joy listening to this music this morning. I don't get to church as regularly as I like, with health problems and all that, but it is quite a thrill to hear this singing today. I really appreciate that. My home church in Olean is on 3rd Street, 2nd Baptist. My father, excuse me, the mind wanders, you know. Reverend Barnes had each man trained in a skilled trade, and then he would lease these men out to his neighbors around Washington County. And because they were educated and could read and write and calculate, they could keep time. They'd have a notebook and write down the work accomplished and bring those records back to Reverend Barnes so he knew what to charge to his neighbors. Well, Henry, taken at such a young age, had a difficult time in Hagerstown to start. But he was trained as a seedman and a gardener, and as he grew older, he took pride in his work and became quite skilled at it. Well, about the year 1835, Reverend Barnes finding himself in poor health and realizing he had not long to live, gathered his 19 slaves, all men, to his bedside in the middle of the night. He told them that since he had not long left in this world, he had decided to liberate them. And he gave them each their manumission papers, their free papers, as well as $200 for each man, which in those times was quite a substantial amount of money. He told them, however, they had to leave immediately that night, because he fully expected that in the morning his heirs, his family, would discover what he had done. They would go right to the courthouse and have a judge declare him insane and incompetent, because what sane man would give away all that wealth? So he told them there were wagons and horses in the stables there for them to take, but they were to leave those just over the Pennsylvania line with a man he had arranged. And then he asked one more thing of them. He asked them all to take the name of Barnes. Well, they all agreed to that. And set off, saying their solemn goodbyes. Daybreak found the refugees over the state line in Pennsylvania, where they left the wagons and the horses as arranged. Some of them used some of their money to arrange transportation north, because Reverend Barnes had said they must go immediately to Canada. They must make their way as quickly as possible with all haste and caution. Most of the party, however, were walking. At Lewistown, Pennsylvania, Mifflin County, the fugitives were overtaken by a posse of family members, marshals, slave hunters, who surrounded the town. Most of the men got away, but 2 were trapped in the town. Jerry Barnes was hidden down a water well by the townspeople of Lewistown. Lewistown was a known station on the Underground Railroad, which is why the search party had come there directly. The other man, my father, Henry, was secreted under a barn for almost 2 days, 2.5 days, until the search party, having searched every building, every home, every field, gave up and moved on north, trying to catch the others. The townspeople of Lewistown released the men from their hiding places and examined them. They looked carefully at their manumission papers and recognized them as being valid. And then they interviewed them, and determining that these 2 men were educated, better educated than most of the white people in Lewistown, as a matter of fact, and were in possession of skills that would allow them to earn a living, they were welcomed into the town and invited to settle there. Henry, my father, married a young woman of Lewistown, Pennsylvania, a free woman of color, but very light-skinned, Jane Williams. And together they started our family. My father said that Reverend Barnes was a cold exploiter of colored men and boys. And he said that his education and his training as a gardener and a seed man was one of the greatest gifts of his life. And he was grateful for that. My father died young, and my mother, bless her soul as well, died soon after that. And I was taken to Brooklyn, New York by my uncle, my mother's brother, Uncle Peter. And eventually, under his care and patronage, I entered the New York Colored Orphans Asylum in Manhattan and had many adventures there. But that's a story for another day. And I hope you will invite me back to tell some of those stories. But I thought I would offer a different kind of story for my second tale. Would you be interested in hearing a story that's taken from a number of different sources? You know, since my father told me all those tales about slavery days, I have been fascinated by that history all my life. And I try to find all the books and articles that I can read about those times. You know, our president here in 1942, President Roosevelt, several years ago initiated a project called the Federal Writers Project. And those writers interviewed former slaves, took down their stories and published them. So this story is partly taken from those narratives, partly little bits and pieces from my father's stories, and I should just admit flat out some of it's from my imagination. Would you be interested in such a tale?
Yes.
You're very kind. I appreciate your forbearance. Long, long ago in Africa, the stories say that the people could fly. They would listen to the wind and the sound of the breeze in the trees. Pay close attention, listening very carefully. And as the wind rose, these people could remember the magic. They would lift one foot on the wind and then spread their arms wide and let the magic of the breeze and the wind carry them up, up, up above the trees, until, like ravens, like crows, like blackbirds, there they were, flying dark against a bright blue sky. That is what the stories say. Long, long ago in Africa, there came a time that the people came to Africa who stole the land, they stole the animals, and they even stole people. And some of those Africans were put on slaver ships and carried across the ocean. They were put inside the ships where there was no light, down in the holds in the cargo areas, crammed in there, so close together that they could barely move. Now they say when the people could fly, if they flew far enough and long enough and often enough, they would grow wings, wide, black, shiny wings that could carry them far. But in the holds of the ships, there was no room for wings, and the people lost them. Down in that darkness, they lost the scent of home. They could no longer smell what they knew as the coast of their home. There was no light there, and they began to despair of ever seeing light again. The sea moved the ship from side to side and side to side, and the people were in misery, unable to eat for all that sickness, barely able to breathe. Weeks and weeks they were upon the sea until finally they came to a new land. And when they were taken from the ships in chains, there were people there to greet them. People with chains and whips who were called slave keepers or slave drivers in the employ of the slave keepers. And the people worked in the fields from can't see to can't see, from darkness early in the morning until long after dark in the evening, with just a few hours to sleep before they had to be up again and working. There was little food, just enough to keep them alive and working. There was a plantation and an old man working in the field. He had a granddaughter there on that place with him, and she carried a baby in a blanket on her shoulder as she worked in the field. The drivers, the slave drivers who oversaw the workers, would walk or ride on horseback up and down the rows while they pulled weeds, while those enslaved men and women cared for the plants and pulled the weeds from the field. And this particular day, this young girl was working near her grandfather, and her baby cried, and she was afraid because she knew that if the driver heard the baby crying, he would tell her to make it stop. She was not a very experienced mother, and she was tired, but she tried to quiet the baby, but the child cried and cried, and finally the driver noticed and shouted, to hush that child now! And she tried again, but the child cried and cried. The driver came to her in the field, lifted his whip, cracked his whip, and opened a gash on her arm. He cracked that whip again and opened a gash on her back. She fell to the ground, the baby beneath her, and the driver went back up the other end of the field where there were other Africans working, but who had stopped to watch the sea. And as he walked away, the old man came to her and lifted her up, and she murmured to him, I must leave this place. I must go. And he just nodded. And then he listened very carefully to the breeze, which was just barely stirring. He listened, and as he turned his head, listening, the wind began to rise. He told the girl to raise one foot as high as she could, hold the baby on her back, and raise her arms. And the wind rose push down on the wind, he said, and it will raise you. And she did. And she began to rise off the ground. She rose higher and higher. The driver at the other end of the field turned and saw her rising, and he shouted, "You there! You come back here!" But she was up there. She was not coming down. There were other Africans near the old man, and they ran to him, and he nodded. And they raised one foot, and he listened carefully, and the breeze turned to wind, and they stretched their arms, and the wind raised them up higher and higher. The driver now was shouting to the other men to come now, they're getting away. And all those men came running. Then the old man was the only one left at that end of the field, and he raised his foot not very high because he was an old man with old bones, but high enough. And he spread his arms, and the wind lifted him, and now all the Africans from that side of the field were up in the air, and the driver and all those overseer men came running with their whips, trying to hit those people and knock them out of the sky, but they were up there, like ravens, like crows, like blackbirds, black shapes against the clear blue sky. All of those Africans that had been in the field did not fly to freedom that day. Some learned to fly later. Some ran to freedom across the fields, and some came to freedom in other ways. They say that you could not tell from looking at a man or a woman if they knew the magic to fly. They all looked the same to those white people. And they say that the people who knew the magic taught others to fly. That's what the stories say. And the people who knew how to fly told that story and passed it on, and the people who did not know how to fly told that story and passed it on. And now I hope that since you know the story, that you will tell it and pass it on. Thank you. Do I have 2 minutes or 3 minutes for Q&A?
Yeah, she's just coming to set up now.
So you may ask your questions of Thomas Henry Barnes, or you may ask your questions of my granddaughter, my great-granddaughter, who's around here someplace, I know. Does anybody have any questions? No?
Wonderful story.
Just left.
I'll go sit down then. Excuse me.
Your grandfather flying?
T.H. Barnes.
Okay.
I have not ever known how to fly. I have never even been in an airplane, though I am quite impressed with those activities. My father told stories about people flying, but he didn't believe the stories himself. So that may be why I never learned to fly.
Did he write books or journals or?
Yeah, well, he left a manuscript to the family, and I have copies of that. We have printed up the copies of my father's book. So I only brought a few copies with me, but if you're interested in them, want to take a look. So these are my own words from T.H. Barnes. When the orphanage that I lived in from 1861 until about 1868, my great-granddaughter tells me those are $15, which seems exorbitant. My goodness gracious. The orphanage where I spent part of my childhood was burned during the draft riots of 1863 in Manhattan, and that's one of the stories that I like to tell because most people in this country don't know that story. But when many years later, in 1924, there was a reunion of those of us who were inmates. We called ourselves inmates, and that was not a derogatory term. That was a phrase we used in the New York Colored Orphans Asylum. They invited us to come and speak. Myself and a friend that I did not know were still living. And I reunited there in 1924, and they asked me to write a history of the burning of the Colored Orphans Asylum and in my time there. It was a Quaker-run institution, and I received a fine education there and was supposed to go to Oberlin, but I got cold feet because it was so far. That's in too. So I left this manuscript to my family, and that's why some people do know some of these stories of mine. So I started this manuscript in 1924 at the request of the orphanage, and I've just added to it over the years.
Was this the same place that Ella Fitzgerald was, in the same place that she was?
I did not know that, but I barely know the name of Ella Fitzgerald myself. I'll become Fanny. Okay. I have heard of some other people who lived there, but I can't remember if she was, I don't remember her as being one of the people, but that doesn't mean she wasn't. They existed until 1937, I believe.
Okay.
They were still operating, so she could have been there. That's within the time frame that she certainly could have been there. I think it's my turn to sit down. Thank you very much.
What can I
Oh, no. We're just gonna have lunch.
Okay.
We're breaking.